Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 124 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Allison Gilbert for this episode. And Allison was my guest back in episode 35, where we talked about her book, Past and Present, which is all about ways to keep the memory of our loved ones alive. This week, we talk about her new book, which is called Listen World, and it's a biography, and in our discussion, we uncovered the really important idea that biography is perhaps an underappreciated tool in terms of grief support. Much like memoir, a great biography can be a window into other people's grief journeys. And so in our discussion, we look at how Elsie Robinson, who is the subject of Listen World, chose to build a life for herself in the face of much grief and hardship. Before we jump into my discussion this week with Allison, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. So, first of all, I wonder if you saw the news recently that 10.5 million kids worldwide have lost a parent to COVID. And this is according to new numbers from the Journal of the American Medical Association. 10.5 million. That is a staggering number. And these kids and their surviving parents are going to need support. You might be one of those surviving parents, or maybe you know someone who is. So if you found your way here, welcome. First of all, I'm very glad that you found the show. I'm not glad that you needed to find the show, but since you are here, I'm glad you found it. And I want to make sure you know about all the resources available over at my website, which is jennylisk.com. In addition to the backlist of 100 some odd episodes and articles and book recommendations and links to grief centers, including a tool to look up and find a grief center based on your location or your zip code, and many more links to resources. The number one resource over at my website that I wanted to make sure you know about is an article that I wrote actually for Parent Map, which is a parenting magazine, and it's called I'm a Widowed Mom. Here are my 3 tips for COVID-19 widows. So if you go to my website, jennylisk.com, and look up at the top where it says Start Here, and click there. It's right on the top of that Start Here page. You'll find a link to this article. And it's not just for moms, and it's also not just for those widowed by COVID, even though I did, the title is specific to those 2 populations. It's broader than that. So if you're a widowed parent, please check it out, and I think you will find it helpful. And one more thing, Future Widow is now available in large print. Future Widow is my memoir, which talks about the time when my husband Dennis was sick with cancer, and importantly, how I learned to be a widowed parent, including what I wished I had known at the time and what I'm hoping will be helpful to readers who may also be widowed parents or have a terminally ill spouse. So it's now available in large print. You can ask your favorite indie bookstore to order it for you, and you can also find it, of course, at Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and all the other online stores. And, of course, you can also, in any of those places, you can get the hardcover book or the paperback book. And the ebook version is available wherever you get your ebooks. And then, like I said, the large print version is now available if that would be useful to you. Okay, that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Allison Gilbert. Allison is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and a best-selling author and speaker and workshop leader on the topics of grief and resilience. She's written 3 books on grief and loss, including Past and Present, Parentless Parents, and Always Too Soon. Allison started her career in TV news, covering most every major news story in the last 20 years, including 9/11, when she was on the job and was nearly killed by the falling debris. Her newest book out this week is a biography called Listen World, How the Intrepid Elsie Robinson Became America's Most Read Woman. Allison is joining us today from New York. Allison, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jenny. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, and thank you for coming back on the show. I should say for listeners that we first talked way back in episode 35, and it was about keeping the memories of our loved ones alive. And specifically, we talked all about your book, Past and Present, which I continue to recommend to people. I think it's a terrific book, and there's a lot of really practical ideas for keeping the memories of our loved ones alive. All sorts of ways, some are tech, some are craft, some are I don't know, all kinds of things. So I'm going to put a link to our discussion in episode 35 and a link to your book, Past and Present, in the show notes, because I want to make sure people check that out as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But today we are, of course, here to talk about your brand new book, Listen World, which is a totally different type of book. It's a biography, which is very exciting. And you've been working on it for a long time with your co-author. And so why don't we just jump right in? I know you've said that Elsie Robinson is the most influential newspaper columnist that you've never heard of. So how did you hear about her?
Well, we can just start right into the grief work that I have done because it's all related to how I found out about Elsie Robinson to begin with. My mother died shortly after I graduated college, and my brother and I went back to our childhood home to clean it out, to prep it for sale. And I was really having a tough time, and I was dragging the chores out. I was making it last a lot longer than it perhaps, I was going to say should have, but who knows about should, right? I was really making it last a very long time. And part of the reason why is that one of my jobs was going through my mom's books and packing them up. And I was so bereft that I couldn't just take the books off the shelves, put them in a box, tape up the box, move on. I just couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, if you can imagine what this might have looked like, I would take a book off the shelf, look at every page, see what my mom had annotated or not, looking for her handwriting, seeing if she left a note inside, just seeking connection to her. And lo and behold, this is how it relates to Elsie Robinson. One of the last books that I was looking through, a piece of paper did in fact fall out of the book. And it was a poem. And it was a poem that she had retyped. And it was a poem about grief and loss. And it was attributed to someone named Elsie Robinson. And I did not know who Elsie Robinson was.
And you're thinking
the poem was unbelievable.
So you're wondering, is this your mom's friend or neighbor or teacher, or who is this Elsie person?
I needed to know because the poem is called Pain. And it was really tough love. It was really stop crying, be joyful, be happy, be grateful that you had someone who was worth missing. And that kind of tough love is exactly the tone my mother would have taken with me had she been able to console me about her own death. That would have been my mom's take. And so this poem, Pain, written by Elsie Robinson, just made me feel really connected to my mom at a time where I was feeling the most vulnerable and the most cracked open. And I just had to find out who Elsie Robinson was.
Yeah. Well, and so you said you were just out of college. So this was probably in the 90s, I guess?
Yeah, exactly.
And this poem was written probably a lot of decades before you stumbled across it. Do you have any idea approximately when it was written?
I for sure do. So Elsie Robinson died in 1956. And prior to that, there was an anthology that was just released nationwide. And her poem, Pain, was included in that anthology. So I am 99.9% certain it was from that poetry collection. Although Elsie Robinson, as I came to understand, was a syndicated newspaper columnist. And so it could have been that parts of this poem showed up through her 40-year career writing articles. However, we did exhaustive work, my co-author and we did not find a trace of this poem in her columns, even though she included other poems that she wrote in her columns. We could talk about that later. But for all intents and purposes, the poem that we found was definitely in that anthology, and that's where it came from.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that she died in 1956. She was born, I think, in the prior century, right?
1883. Yep.
Wow. Okay, so that's a long time ago.
Yeah, she was born in 1883. I mean, the world was a very different place back then. You know, she grew up the way we imagine in the history books, you know, with corsets and, you know, how tight can you pull them so your waist becomes, 19 inches, with fainting couches because the women could not breathe deeply. I mean, this is literally the Victorian era that she grew up in. And so quite literally, she railed against the physical constraints of that time, the clothing and everything else, but also like the constraints on her growth as a human, right? She wanted to write. She wanted to be involved with the arts. She wanted to have this bigger, richer, more fulfilling life. And every single turn, she felt browbeaten by her times, very restricted by what women were supposed to be doing back then. And finally, in 1912, she had enough, and she took her only son with her. She left her marriage. She needed a way out, and she started a new life so she could pursue her dream of self-fulfillment.
So interesting. I mean, almost a woman before her time.
Oh, I am in love with Elsie. I can't, my co-author, you mentioned, Julia and I, this was our project during the height of the pandemic. And there was no one I would rather be shacked up with than Elsie Robinson. I mean, her words are inspiring. They are full of grit and moxie and confidence. And to me, they became a real lifeline, not just during COVID, but of course, just in terms of her take on marriage and family, but also racism and capital punishment and listening to divergent points of view. I mean, she kind of tackled every subject that we would have considered today a hot button subject, but she did it back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and even the 50s. So she was talking about things that I think that we think are new today. She was born well before Gloria Steinem, and she was talking about, feminism and women being equal to men in pay and jobs. I mean, well before not only Gloria Steinem, but, let's say Betty Friedan, or like all these conversations that we all kind of glom onto as being vital. Yes, of course, they are vital, but these are the voices that came even before.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, and it seemed to me as I was reading the book and as I've heard you talking that there was also an undercurrent of grief through much of her life and experience and writing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that is really what drew me to her and kept me going. She experienced tremendous loss in her life. Maybe I shouldn't disclose who she lost because I'll give away part of the plot, but it was significant. And the way she writes about grief and really the pit of despair that she found herself in, I found to be, and I write about grief all the time, right? You mentioned some of my past books about loss, but the way she wrote herself out of feeling isolated, feeling trapped in many emotions, including anger and sadness and self-pity and all the things that sometimes we don't maybe admit to wrestling with. Elsie Robinson did, and she put these thoughts on paper, and not just as a way to vent, by the way. The real instructive part about reading a biography, I feel, and why I'm so grateful that you were brave and bold enough to have me on talking about an atypical book on your podcast, is that biography can be this kind of wonderful tool we don't think of when it comes to healing after loss. We think about support groups. We think about going on social media and maybe going into a community of other people who understand what we're going through. But I feel biography can do something similar, where we can read about another person's experience of grief and loss, see what he or she did when they were the most torn apart, and how they rebuilt. And I feel like that's what hearing Elsie's own words, and we put a lot of her own words throughout the book, allows us to really see and feel more power from reading.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that so much in the context of biography. I know that's come up in the context of memoir. And of course, memoir and biography are both about someone's life, and it's a question of who's writing it, of course. But I know that, like when I was talking with Zibby Owens, for example, and I know you know her as well, that this idea that in memoir, it's like she says it's like sitting down with a friend for coffee and hearing about something about their life and learning from that. And I think you bring up a great point here, that this is another way to do that. And I think it makes total sense that you, with your journalism background, right, are well prepared to dive in and say, who's this Elsie woman and what can we learn from her life? And
I'm grateful that you're bringing in those, like you're tying it all together in a way that perhaps, you did it so wonderfully well and so beautifully, Jenny. I do feel that memoir kind of pulls back that curtain, right? We're peeking into someone's private life. And I feel like if a biography is well done, and hopefully Listen World is well done, you'll have to be the judge.
It is, absolutely.
I feel like it's the same thing. Like you're peeling back the curtain to see how someone else was at the depths of their life when it couldn't get worse, and how just one foot in front of the other, day by day, moment by moment, they rebuilt. And I feel like there's lessons in there for all of us.
Yeah, and for my listeners who are, many of them are facing some of these similar questions, like what's next for me? How do I take the next step day after day or minute after minute or, whatever, wherever they're at in the journey, in the process. Seeing those examples, like you said, of the kinds of thought processes and decisions and choices that other people have made are an interesting part of that support. Yeah, I like that. Cool.
I can read you. I brought a little sample with me if you want me to.
Yes, please. Yes. Is this the poem that you mentioned in the beginning, the one that you found in your mother's books?
I could do that one, but the one I was thinking of was just based on what you were just talking about going forward bit by bit. And there was a poem that we included in the back of Listen World. It's on page 265 for anyone who has their book with them. It's page 265.
I have it right here in front of me.
Yep, it was originally printed in 1934.
And so in the height of the Great Depression.
Yes, it's called I Build Happiness. And in terms of how we can all move forward after loss, the reason why I love this poem so much is that it puts the responsibility back on our shoulders. Those who are grieving when loss is new, we do get external support. But at some point, there always is that shift where we need to accept the responsibility for our own path forward, no matter what the pain. And so to me, let me read you a part of this poem that I like so much.
Okay, great.
So this is when Elsie is that she really wants happiness just to come back into her life. And so she says, I began to wish that happiness would come back to me. But I wished as a paralyzed man might wish for movement. The paralyzed man thinks of motion coming back to him in a sudden miracle. I thought of happiness coming back to me in that way. I felt that I myself could do nothing about it. It would just have to happen without my volition. And I waited for it to happen. I waited for happiness to come sweeping back again, like a glittering tide, like the song of a bird, like sunrise. But it did not come. Weeks, months, years I waited, but happiness did not happen, and my life was going stagnant. It was becoming a malignant thing because I was not happy. And then this is where it gets awesome. Then dimly I began to perceive that I was wrong. Happiness could not ever come back that way. For that sort of involuntary happiness was a part of something that had gone forever. And basically what she was talking about from there is that the involuntary happiness, that was gone. But what she could attain was the work that gets happiness. So the choice, let's say, to go for a walk, the decision, let's say, to go meet a friend for dinner, the opportunity that awaits to go plan perhaps a weekend away in a place that kind of brings you joy. These are choices. And I feel like this poem, rightfully so, puts the pressure on us to really come to terms after we lose a loved one, a spouse, a child, a brother, a sister. The job is on us eventually to decide how we are going to move forward. So the poem is called I Build Happiness, and we included the entire poem in Listen World in our biography of Elsie Robinson, because I thought it was just so important to her worldview on grief.
Yeah. Okay. And that's terrific. And I would like to read some of what's on page 267 now. Because
go ahead.
I jumped ahead from where you ended before. I jumped ahead a few paragraphs. And then Elsie says, happiness must be planned for, fought for, achieved. And so I learned to build happiness. And then it says in all caps, I no longer waited for happiness to happen. I made it happen. I realized I had to be happy. I decided to be happy. I decided to find happiness, and I began looking for it.
It's so true. Like, you can't get any more true than that, right? Her point of view that when you're a child, things just kind of happen by accident. It's because that's childhood. And when you get older, we need to make these choices that build our happiness. And by the way, that one, I have to say this, but when you chose, Jenny, that line, happiness must be fought for, planned for, fought for, achieved, I must say Julia Shears, my co-author, and I, for this charity called 826 Valencia, they help at need children learn the craft of writing. They're based out in the Bay Area where Elsie Robinson was from. We have put Elsie Robinson's best quotes, some of her best artwork. We didn't talk about her artwork yet, on Society 6, so people can buy that exact quote on a mug or on a t-shirt or on a tote bag, because it's such a great line. Yeah. And we put all of Elsie's best lines at the Society 6 page. So if people Google Elsie Robinson says, Says, Elsie Robinson says, there's a shop on Society 6, and a portion of all the purchases will benefit 826 Valencia.
Nice. Okay. Well, and maybe if you don't mind, if you send me that link, I'll throw it into the show notes as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And we can send people directly to there if they're interested in finding that. That's really cool. So where to go from here? I'm thinking, well, you just mentioned her drawings. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And how she got started with that too?
Yeah, it's so interesting. We all have these, well, many of us have these talents that we don't pay much attention to until we need to, for example. So Elsie's hidden talent when she was a young mom is that she was a great illustrator. She knew how to draw incredible cartoons for her son. And this was, he was born in the early 1900s. So this is no TV, no iPads, no radio. And so she would draw him stories and she would write the stories too. So she had this talent. And why this is relevant is that when she left her husband, she was poor, poor, poor. She needed a way to make a living. She was destitute. And eventually, she did, in fact, find work as a children's writer and illustrator at the Oakland Tribune. She got that job in 1918, and she traded on what had been a hobby, and she made it into her very well-paying job that only launched her into this incredible trajectory that eventually landed her in the entire William Randolph Hearst media empire, where she eventually transitioned to writing for adult readers. And her column was called Listen World, and that's why we named the book Listen World.
And this was a huge column, right? I mean, it was syndicated all over the country with millions of readers. It was like, I don't know, reading Ann Landers or something, right?
Oh, yeah. No, this was absolutely what you've just described. This was huge. She had more than 20 million readers, 20 million just in the Hearst-owned newspapers alone. And then, of course, Hearst had a syndicate arm, King Features, and then that was picked up in papers that were not owned by Hearst, but ran King Features syndicated content, of which her Listen World column was picked up. Some estimates put it at more than 50 million readers.
Wow. Huh. One of the things that I couldn't help but noticing as I was reading the book, and you mentioned her first husband, who she divorced, he was affected by grief. And I almost want to say it was like a grief that he had, ignored or buried, or obviously it was a different time. People didn't, I don't know how people didn't have grief support, maybe groups back then or therapists, but it almost seemed like his story, and therefore her story, was profoundly affected by the grief he had experienced and maybe not dealt with.
You are such a careful reader. I am so impressed. Yes, her husband had tremendous grief in his own life. I'll describe just quickly. One, a baby brother died in infancy. Two, another brother took his own life. And then three, there's more, but the third was that his first wife was a beautiful, like cherub of a young girl. And she died almost as soon as they got married. And so tragedy upon tragedy really informed his worldview. But instead of reaching out, as you were just describing, everyone deals with things, of course, differently. And in his case, in his time, the house that he was in grew darker. It grew colder. People went inside figuratively and literally and, drew the curtains and didn't want to leave. And I feel that made their marriage that much colder. It made it that much harder for Elsie to create, intimacy of any kind, physical or emotional. And so I think you're right. There are different grief experiences and how they each chose to move forward back to that choice. This imperative of choosing your own path, having agency to just, so much of loss is out of our control. even if you anticipate the death, right? The moment of loss is always out of our control. And Elsie Robinson chose to move forward in a proactive, building happiness. I'm going to move forward and become empowered and salvage the remaining days that I have. And her husband had similar loss. And yet you could see from reading the book, Listen World, how he had the opposite response to the same losses in many cases.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And the other thing I was thinking about, in terms of her making choices of how she was going to move forward and define herself moving forward, I was thinking about her using writing as one of those, what should I say, maybe methods of processing. I mean, she was writing for lots of reasons, and one of it was economic necessity, right? One of it was she loved to do it. But it also seemed like, it allowed her the space to explore topics, in print, in expressing herself. I'm sure you can articulate this much better than I, but I noticed, because I know a lot of people are interested in writing through grief, right? Sometimes you see grief writing workshops, or, people, as you and I have both written memoirs about grief. And I think this notion of grief and writing and the intersection and the opportunities for dealing with our grief through writing is an interesting one that I noticed here as well.
I'm going to probably get the quote not perfectly correct, but it's something like this, that Elsie started writing for exactly the way, I'm going to start again. Elsie started writing for exactly the same reason that a starving man begins eating, to save her life. So we in the grief world know that for many people, keeping a journal or putting thoughts on paper in any way, shape, or form is incredibly helpful. It's purging in some ways, getting your thoughts out of your head, stopping the rumination and getting it onto a page can be incredibly cleansing. And Elsie Robinson felt the same way. She didn't think it's almost like a blogger today. There was nothing too personal that she thought she wouldn't share. She thought everything in her words were common bread, that we're all in this together, that no one's pain is so different than somebody else's. We're all suffering loss. And so how we move through it, we can learn from each other, because the experiences can be, if we look at it in that way, something that we can understand through empathy and sympathy, that we could be in it together.
So interesting. I just, as you said that, I'm thinking, if Elsie Robinson were alive today, would she be blogging? Would she be on TikTok? Like she would.
She, her pace was grueling. By our count, we did an investigation of an interrogation, a real examination of how many columns and pieces of writing that she did in her career. 9,000 columns or essays by our estimate. We looked at the years, we saw her pacing, we saw how many times that she published. And in many ways, I don't want to overstate it, but she was a blogger before bloggers existed. I mean, the pace at which she wrote was grueling, and she didn't just take it as a soldier. I mean, she complained about the pace, even to William Randolph Hearst directly. She said, "You're treating me like a factory."
Elsie Robinson, content creator, mother of all content creators.
That's actually true. That's a piece I should write. Perfect.
Yeah, there you go. There's your headline.
That's perfect. I love it. I love it. Yes, that's exactly what she was. And she, she's also, we're talking about her in such glowing ways, but I could also paint a picture of someone whose lifestyle in many ways we wouldn't want to emulate, right? She worked herself to the bone. She was exhausted. She suffered. Her health suffered because she was such a, I think, workaholic. And so I think there's instructive lessons in how she lived for both what to do and what to avoid.
Yeah. This is all so fascinating. I can't let you go without hearing a snippet from the poem that started this whole journey. And it also is printed in the end of the book. Can you what's it called? And read us a little part of that, please.
Yeah, so this is the poem that I found after my mother died when I was cleaning out my childhood home. This is the poem that Elsie wrote. It was attributed to her. And at the time, I didn't know who Elsie Robinson was, but it's called Pain. And if you go to page 263, 264 in the book, you'll see it there. But this is the short part that I want to read about pain. And this is that tough love part that I was talking about earlier. Pain is part of growth. The more we feel, the more we suffer. For if we were able to feel beauty, we must also feel the lack of it. Those who glimpse heaven are bound to sight hell. To have felt deeply is worth anything it cost. The reason why I like that poem, Jenny, is that to me, those of us, and I include myself in this group, when we lose the person that we love most, there is so much sadness over what we lost. And it takes a while. Maybe for some people, it's a few weeks. Maybe for others, it's 20 years. But eventually, we can embrace the idea that Elsie Robinson writes about, that we are lucky to have had someone so good that they are worth missing. I feel like that is a wonderful lesson to walk away with. And then she continues, if I may. Mm-hmm. She says, to have felt love and honor, courage and ecstasy is worth any price. And so, since hurt is the price of larger living, I will not hate pain nor try to escape it. Because what's the alternative? Having cut yourself off from the person that you miss? I feel like the way she describes that is actually the kind of tough love that I needed to hear when I had loss, is that it felt so big. And yet, if I was really to just take this kind of Elsie Robinson step back, would I have preferred not to have had that incredible love in my life? And the answer, of course, is no. And so it takes a while to get there. But I feel like this Elsie Robinson poem, Pain, there was a reason why we included it in this biography, Listen World, is because it's one of her great lessons. It's like, listen, world, this is her lesson about grief and loss. And it spoke to me.
Yeah. Well, I think that is actually a beautiful place to end. So my guest today is Allison Gilbert, author of the brand new book, Listen World, How the Intrepid Elsie Robinson Became America's Most Read Woman. So Allison, where can listeners find your book and find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
You can find the book anywhere books are sold. Listen World is sold on every platform and in every store. And I am everywhere at A. Gilbert Writer on social media, or my website is just my name, AllisonGilbert.com.
Okay, terrific. Well, congratulations on the book coming out. And Allison, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, Jenny. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Allison Gilbert as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com, like for episode 124. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.